All right. First of all, the Praxis is going to have their first speaker, and it's going to be Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock in lane 125. And it's going to be Dave Hebert, who is a professor at Aquinas College, and but he's a 2009 Hillsdale College grad, so it might be interesting to come and listen to him. So again, it's going to be in lane 125, which is next door. So we're going to have lane 125, 7 p.m. on Wednesday. And he's going to be speaking on public choice issues. Again, if you take my 415 class in public choice, one of the things that's what we do is use economic analysis to take a look at the political system. And it says every 4 years, political candidates tell us how they're going to solve all of our problems if elected. And then he's going to discuss why they're not likely to be able to do that and how the economic system interacts with the political system. So again, you can take a listen. And he's a 2009 ECON grad from here, so it might be fun to just say hi. Second thing is band pick of the week. For this week, I'll give you another band pick on Wednesday because I skipped the band pick last week, but is a band called Wallows. Is anybody? Okay, so all right, so somebody's here. They're an indie rock band out of LA. They started in 2017. It's a trio, a couple guitar players and percussion, and they signed with Atlantic Records. So you might want to just take a listen to some of their work. They did a song called Pleaser. That was one of their first hits. So anyway, you might want to take a listen to them. And the classic album of the week from last week, which I didn't do, is an album by Van Morrison called Astral Weeks. This is a 1968 album. It was a second album by himself. You might remember a song called Gloria. And that he did with a band called Them, and then he went out on his own. So anyway, on this, Astral Weeks is the title track to this. So you might want to take a look at that. And there's another called Sweet Thing that got a lot of publicity. So anyway, Van Morrison, take a listen to Van. All right. So last time we were talking about what Hayek was saying about some of the things that Bastiat talked about, that liberty's not power, and that he was just as Bastiat was talking about Louis Blanc in the letter to Louis Blanc, that liberty's not power. Hayek refers to John R. Commons and John Dewey, who are basically economists, political philosophers of the time, and saying, yeah, the liberty is the ability to choose on your own, to act according to your own plan, given what your circumstance is. And that if what you do is you argue that liberty is dependent on the number of choices that you have, just like Bastiat said, it's an argument for redistribution rather than and to take from the rich and give to the poor. And Hayek argues against that idea of looking at what liberty is. That liberty, again, is the ability to just, given where you are, can you make those decisions about your own? And then he said that historically that it was granted through the particular liberties. That is, when we read How the West Grew Rich, we'll look at the feudal period, but liberty sort of went through by saying, okay, the king's going to grant you the ability to do this, and then the king will grant you the ability to do that. So today, you think that you can do things unless it's prohibited, right? You just have the opposite. That if, again, I use the example of when you're looking for a parking spot, you're not looking for signs that say you can park here, right? You assume you can park there unless there's a sign that says you can't park here. So that we've over the centuries transitioned in the West in particular, but over the centuries we transitioned to a state where now you can you think that you can do things. You have general rules. You have general rights. And what we talked about several times the Declaration of Independence, right? You have these inalienable rights, and government is formed in order to protect those rights. Government doesn't grant you what those rights are. But if this were 1200 AD, you'd be looking at the world very differently. So then he just wants to discuss a little bit about historically about the ancient Greeks. And that's basically where we started to, in the West, we began to think through what it means to be a free person. And he said that if you look at what's the difference between a slave and a free person among the ancient Greeks. And the first characteristic, he says, is that you have basically legal status as a protected member of the community. And that's how he phrases it. The legal status is a protected member of the community. But if we were to put that in our language here that we've been talking about, that would say you have equal protection under the law. Right? That you have you have equal protection under the law. If you are a free person, then they can't treat you differently than somebody else. It's also a free person. Okay? So you have this this legal status that as a free person in society. Second thing he says is freedom from arbitrary arrest. Freedom from arbitrary arrest. And of course, that's something that we see today. Third thing is the right to work at whatever or the right to attempt to work at whatever you choose. Or we'll say, we're going to put right to work at whatever you choose, but here's the explanation. That is, you can't be precluded from this particular occupation. It doesn't mean that you're going to satisfy it. I mean, you can't say, well, gee, I want to look like this guy, right? I want to be a rock and roll star, and so I have the right to do that. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that you have the right to try that, right? You might be successful, like Van Morrison, or you might be unsuccessful. I don't want to say like my son, because he did not become a rock and roll star and sort of wanted to, but I don't want to say. He ended up getting his MBA at Yale instead, so he's probably that was probably the right thing for him to do. But anyway, but it's the we'll say the right to attempt work at whatever you choose. It doesn't mean that you're going to be successful, but it means that you can you can't be precluded from trying to do that sort of thing. Fourth thing is the right to movement. So they can't say you can't go into that city, right? Or and we have that in the United States, right? The state of Ohio can't preclude you from entering the state of Ohio. If you're a free person, if you're a citizen of the United States, you can move around. Now, if you're a citizen of the United States, it doesn't mean you have the right to move to Mexico, right? Because that's a different place. But what we're talking about here is you have the right to movement within the ancient Greek civilization. And lastly, the right to own property. And slaves couldn't own property. Actually, women in places weren't able to own property. But if you're a free person, you have the right to own property. Now, why bring this up is that he's saying that this is the foundation for what it turned out to be by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century. This is, if we look at the 18th and 19th century idea of freedom, these are basic attributes of that. So if you look at how the United States Constitution is drafted, what it looks like, you'll see that it has this general idea that what they had in the ancient Greeks. So he's saying, why is it that you had liberty showing up here rather than in Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa or whatever? Okay? That you have this philosophical idea starting out centuries ago that's consistent with getting you to today where you have individual liberty. Then he brings up this idea of coercion. Okay? And coercion that's where you have to act according to someone else's plan. Okay? So if you are 15, right, and or I guess 16 maybe, and you're trying to get your driver's license, okay, and your parents are the ones that tell you whether you can take the car out or not. You might want to act according to your own plan and say, hey, I want to take the car out and go drive around today, or I want to go visit my friend in Chicago, so I'm going to drive to Chicago and visit my friend over there, right? Your parents might say, no, you're not, right? What's going on? You're having to act according to their plan, not according to your plan. So coercion is you want to do this, but somebody else is saying, no, you have to do what I tell you to do. And so what this idea about coercion is why I would use the example of teenagers and cars and driving around is because what does coercion do? It means that you don't use your knowledge right? You don't use your knowledge about the situation. And what we, of course, that we would, when we talked about information being decentralized, right? Well, that if information is decentralized, then the issue is, can you know more about your particular circumstance than the other person? When you are a 16-year-old teenager, it is quite possible that your parents know more about what is going to improve your utility than you do. Okay? So you allow coercion, or you expect, let's say you have a 5-year-old, right? You don't let your 5-year-old just go out and do any old darn thing they want, act according to their own plan. Why not? Because they aren't as knowledgeable as you are about their particular circumstance. But when we're talking about adults, right? Once we're talking about adults, what do we want you to do? We want you to be able to act according to your own plan because you know more than the other person does, and we want you to use that knowledge. right? We want you to use that knowledge. And so that's one reason you'd want to have individual liberty is that I want you people to use your knowledge and your thinking ability, and coercion doesn't allow for that, right? Coercion doesn't use your knowledge, doesn't let you do that. So what should we want to do? We want to minimize coercion, right? Which is the same thing as maximize liberty. Right? We want to maximize your ability to act according to your own plan, which means we want to minimize the total amount of times that you get told told what you have to do. And if you have a society based on social cooperation, more like market capitalism, what does that do? That requires that you be a thinking and valuing person, right? What do we say? That you're trying to make yourself better off. Isn't that what we assume? You're rational. That was our basic assumption we started with, right? Our basic assumption when we were looking at demand and supply curves, we started out with this idea that you're a rational, self-interested individual trying to make yourself better off. And so if that's how markets work, if what we want you to do is for market capitalism, what does that do? It requires that you have this situation, right? It's requiring that because you have the system of social cooperation and you're rational, self-interested. That was our basic assumption. So that you can see then that Hayek's point is that if you're going to have market capitalism, what does it require? It requires that you be a thinking and valuing person, right? That's what he says. You have to be a thinking and valuing person. And if you're a thinking and valuing person, the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if we've maximized the amount of individual liberty and minimized the amount that other people are telling you what you have to do. He also points out that we give a monopoly on coercion to government. We're going to give a monopoly on coercion to government. That is, you don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to tell me that you want to take my car. You don't get to tell me that I have to work for you. You don't get to tell me that I have to buy the stuff that you're trying to sell me. Okay? Who gets to decide who gets to decide to coerce you, right? Government is the only one that can do that. And why do we have government then? The same reason that Bastiat said that we have government in order to basically to maximize our freedom, right? To protect our property rights. So why do we have government? It's going to protect property rights. And then what did that do? If we again think back to Mises's liberalism, what is the role of government for Mises, right? The role of government for Mises is limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Now, why did Mises come up with that? Because he wanted to create wealth for the masses. Market capitalism was the only way to do that. Okay. Why do we give a monopoly over coercion, a monopoly on coercion to the government? Because that's what we're going to do, is we're going to minimize total coercion. Right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to minimize the total amount of coercion out there. We're trying to maximize the total amount of freedom. And so what we do is that you don't get to assault me. You don't get to have coercive power over me. We're going to let the government do that. It's not a system of vigilantes, right? I mean, what did Mises say? Liberals are not classical liberals aren't anarchists. Okay, we're going to say government's there to do what? To protect property rights. And Hayek is saying the exact same thing. We're going to give a monopoly of coercion over to our government. You don't get to coerce me. I don't get to coerce you. Okay, but the government gets to coerce us. The government gets to tell us what to do. But why did we give that monopoly of coercion over to them? So that we have a maximization of liberty. We have a minimization of the total amount of coercion. So the purpose of government here is to minimize this total amount of coercion. In this chapter, he starts to talk a little bit about what the laws ought to look like if they're going to be achieve this limitation on the total amount of coercion. Later on, we're going to talk a little bit more about these particular characteristics, but he introduces a couple of them here, and he says that if the law is to minimize the total amount of coercion, right? So we establish a law, give coercive power to our government. If we say, if the law to minimize coercion what should it look like? Like, what are some characteristics? Right, I'll put, what sort of characteristics would we have? And he says that the laws ought to be general. Okay, now, he has a particular meaning of general. He doesn't mean that, oh, it's just sort of be vague, right? What he means by general is that these rules should be impersonal. That's what he means by general. That is, we can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. Right? We shouldn't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. So that everybody that meets the same circumstance will face the same rule of law. Right? So that there's not a different law for you than for me, and I know beforehand. So if we just look at the idea of you got play Monopoly, right? So I don't know if you guys still play Monopoly on a board game, but anyway, in Monopoly there's a square that's called free parking, right? And when you land on free parking, it's free parking. Nothing happens. The official rules of Parker Brothers is that that's what free parking is. But some people play where that if you get something on community chest or chance, you put the money into the middle of the board, and when you land on free parking, you get the money. Has anybody ever played that way? Yeah, okay. Well, when do you decide what the rule is, right? If you decide on the rule, what are we going to do about free parking? You decide that before the game starts, right? And you don't know who's going to land on free parking. You know, if I know you're going to land on free parking, and I get to make the rule, what I'll do is I'll make the rule that free parking is just nothing, right? So we want to make the rules be general in the sense of I don't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. So again, when you look at the old midterms, just like I asked the question, what are some foundations of liberalism, and why did Mises put it in? Right? I'm going to ask you, what are some of the characteristics of the law that Hayek thinks are necessary for it to minimize the total amount of coercion? And you can't just put general. You have to tell me, what do you mean by general? Because if I say the laws are general, you might think, well, that just means it could be pretty broad as to what I'm talking about. That's not what it means. It means I can't know beforehand to whom the laws are applied. And then he says they have to be known, right? And again, we'll talk more about this later on, but people have to know what the law is. And so what he's really trying to do is that you should be able to act according to your own plan, bound by these just general rules for everybody, not for you particularly, not for women, not for people who are left-handed or whatever, right? These laws apply equally to everyone in this, that if you find yourself in a particular circumstance. And so it's sort of like there's a landscape out there that you know what the landscape looks like. You know where the mountains are, you know what the rivers are, and you're able to move around in that landscape. Given what that landscape is, you're free to move around the topography of that. Okay? So, and it's not like, well, there's a hill there for somebody, but not for you. Or there's a river over there for some that you have to cross, but the other people don't have to cross the river. Okay? So the law's being general in that sense. All right. That takes us to chapter 2. And of course, you could obviously see if you don't know what the law is, then how can that minimize the total amount of coercion? Again, we'll bring this up more when we talk about it later. But for example, in this, I think I've mentioned in the state of Michigan, a bill has to remain in both houses for 5 days. A bill cannot take immediate effect unless you have a 3/4 vote of both houses for it to take immediate effect. Okay, why is that? All that's there in your state constitution in order to make it so that people know what the law is. There's also Open Meetings Act law in the state of Michigan that requires that you have to notify people that there's going to be a meeting of the city council or state, or if there's a committee hearing at the state legislature or whatever. Yeah.
So laws are supposed to be general and easily known to all. Would I think that there shouldn't need to be a profession of lawyer? Law should be so easy for everyone to understand that there shouldn't need specific professions to understand it?
Well, that's a good question. Like, what do we need for our government to do? If the laws are limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property, there may be things that, let's say, fraud. Okay? So if, again, we talk about this in my law and economics class, but I have a law against fraud because you wouldn't have made that choice to buy my product if I hadn't misled you on what it is. So, but there might be complicated laws about, okay, what is fraud? How do I go through the courts? Do I have to sue you? And do I have to show, if you caused me, or let's talk about if you caused me harm. If there's an accident. In fact, we just finished the section on tort law in the law and economics. Do I have to show that you caused the accident, or do I have to show that not just that you caused the accident, but so you wrecked my property, but did you meet a certain standard? Were you negligent in causing the accident? And that will affect people's behaviors. So you could still end up with a complicated legal structure, but the point being is, if I'm going to justify this law, I have to justify it in saying this law is there to minimize the total amount of coercion that's out there. But you might have lots of laws that end up doing that. All right? All right, so chapter 2, it's best summarized. There's a quote early on in the chapter. He says, "The main contention of this chapter is that the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depend." Right? So that is, we are ignorant on many of the factors on which our ends are going to be achieved. That is, we don't know what's best for other people, but we may not even know what's best for us, right? So we're ignorant, of all the factors, or we'll say not all the factors. We're ignorant of many of the factors on which our benefits and welfare depend. So the idea of chapter 2 is, again, why should we minimize coercion? Okay, or maximize liberty. We should minimize coercion or maximize liberty is that I can't know what society's goals are, okay? Although when you listen to people running for office, they may say that, but how can we know what the goals of society are? To say, okay, you're going to have to do this, or you're going to have to buy this particular product, or if you make your product, it's going to have to do this. It's going to have to get so many miles per gallon or whatever, right? So why would we want to make it so that we have individual freedom, right? That's what he's talking about. Individual freedom is this ability to act according to your own plan. And why do we want to maximize that? Why do we care about individual liberty? We care about individual liberty because we can't know what's best for everybody. We can't know and he's really talking about we need to experiment to know what's best for us. Right? That is, you think that you want to be a rock and roll star, and so you move to Nashville, and you're going to set up your band, and you have a little recording studio and the like, and you're doing all that, right? But it turns out that you'd be better off getting your MBA from a top school and going out and being a consultant and consulting with businesses. It turns out that's better for you. You don't know that when you start out doing something, right? You got to go out and experiment. You got to go out and try things. And so what he's saying here is, not only can't we know what's best for the other people, but we need to be able to act according to our own plan to find out what's best for us. You can't say, because if somebody said, no, you can't go and try to be a rock and roll star, okay? How do you know that wasn't the best thing for you? You can't figure that out until you go try it, right? And so that's what this chapter about is, that we have to be able to experiment with on our own plans and try to figure that out, even if we can't possibly know what's better for everybody. And so the only way to make that happen is for people to be able to act according to our own plan, right? The only way for society to move forward, that is, people to find out what's the best action for them, is to maximize liberty. To maximize this ability to act according to your own plan. All right. Then the next chapter, chapter 3, again, we're going I mentioned we're going to briefly go over some of the chapters, and then we're going to spend a good deal of time on some of the other chapters. And I'll leave a couple of chapters just for you to read on your own. But so chapter 2 is one of those chapters where you sort of get the idea. Here's what he's talking about in chapter 2. You want to read the whole chapter, but while you're reading a chapter, this is what you should be getting out of. You should be getting out of it. Now, when you look at chapter 3, what chapter 3 is talking about is basically the idea of social evolution. That's what chapter 3 is about. That is, he says that civilization moves forward by one part of you doing something and it works out, and then the rest start to copy. Okay? That is, society moves forward by one group of society advancing, and the other groups follow. That is, when we look at how the West grew rich, what's going to happen is market capitalism develops in the West. Okay? In fact, market capitalism really develops in England or Great Britain. And so what happens is that starts to work, and other people will start to copy it. Right? So if we think about this, if what happened is, what happens there is the rest of the world gains from the advancements of those parts of society that have maybe perhaps even stumbled upon the way to do something. So that the rest of the world gains from the first set of individuals that have discovered an advancement. And so what Hayek argues is that what happened in the West is that where did we come from? Or what did we discover? Market capitalism. That's a primary example. That is, again, market capitalism develops in Great Britain. We're going to see when we read How the West Grew Rich, we don't go straight from feudalism to capitalism. We go feudalism to mercantilism to market capitalism. But what happens over time is there's this group of society where, this subset of the total society ends up with market capitalism. Well, when that happens, you got two things going on. One is other folks follow, right? Other folks, already erased that part. So what happens is other folks follow, but there's also a gain to people who haven't followed yet, right? So there's a gain to the rest of society from capitalism. That is, things that the market capitalist system have innovations that have occurred there. They end up being adopted in adopted in other areas of the world. So that if I have market capitalism and I figure out how to purify water, then people in sub-Saharan Africa that might not have gotten to market capitalism yet, they're going to have the ability to purify their water. That knowledge is going to be there. What what in our law, in the law and economics class we talk about intellectual property rights. We'll have things where when you innovate, other people are going to be able to to gain from these innovations that are now out there. So if you have this market capitalist system, what you explained on the first midterm was the role of profit in coming up with innovation, right? What does profit do? It gives you an incentive to take on the risk of innovation. So if we have a market capitalist system and we have profit and then we get innovations, those innovations don't just stay with the people who invented them, right? The rest of the world now has access to that. And so what Hayek's arguing here is that if we were to just instead, we were to try to equalize income. If that was what we were trying to do, rather than to allow people to act according to our own plan, if instead of trying to maximize liberty, if we were to attempt to equalize income, right? If you were to attempt to redistribute, well, then what will happen? Then the advancement of society would be limited, right? Very similar to what we were talking about at the beginning of the class when we were talking about what happens if you tax economic profit, right? And what did Mises say? Mises said that if you just try to redistribute wealth, then you're not going to end up helping the poor, right? He says that the way to help the poor is to increase their productivity, right? To increase their education or increase the amount of capital that you can have with them. And so what Hayek is saying here is very similar, that if what happens is you become, let's say you had the United Nations, and the United Nations, they felt their role was to redistribute income from those wealthy countries to the poorer countries. Okay? Now, people running for president of the United States may talk about redistributing income from the wealthy in the United States to the less wealthy in the United States. They very seldom talk about redistributing income from everybody in the United States, because you guys are wealthier than we've talked about this before, than the richest person in the world 100 years ago, but you're also enormously wealthy compared to the refugees, right? When I played the refugee tune, and what was the focus? The focus is you don't have to live like a refugee, okay? But if what happens is we're focused on redistribution, then everybody's going to be poorer, and that's what Hayek's trying to point out in this particular chapter. All right, so chapter 4 is basically a follow-up to. We can think of it as a follow-up to chapter 3. And chapter 4 is where his idea of social evolution, right? And his idea of social evolution is that he actually argues that Charles Darwin didn't develop the idea of evolutionary theory, that basically Charles Darwin applied the discussion of social evolution that the Scottish philosophers had been talking about, and he took that and applied it to biology. That is, he says that essentially the Scottish philosophers of the 18th, 19th century, Adam Smith, et cetera, where they're talking about how do markets work and what happens with markets, that basically that what their discussion was is that Darwin applied it to biology. But what's the idea here? Is that you don't have somebody that's directing what's going on. There's no one that has what he calls the hand on the tiller, right? No one is directing where all of society is going. It is what he calls a spontaneous order, right? And this is something that Hayek is famous for talking about. That what we have is a spontaneous order. And what happens then is there is an innovation occurs, and when this innovation occurs, it gets adopted, and then other people benefit from that. And successful innovations move forward, and successful innovations move forward, and unsuccessful ones, what happens? They fall by the wayside. Well, that's what we were talking about with profit, right? That is, if you have a successful innovation, you earn economic profit, right? And then eventually what happens is other firms enter the industry, supply curve shifts to the right, more of it gets dispersed more, distributed more, et cetera. And what happens if you discover something that nobody wants, right? You have this innovation, but nobody wants it, right? It falls by the wayside. Economic profit's negative. And so you don't bother to go forward with it, or if it starts out a little bit and then it turns out that people's preferences change, what will happen is that you'll start making negative economic profit and firms will drop out of the industry. And so he says that basically it's societies that experimented with market capitalism have a better chance of moving forward than societies that don't. And the institutions that are going to develop, that he was going to talk about the institutions, again, what the law should look like, the Constitution, that sort of thing. Those institutions that develop over time are passed on, and they begin to move across countries. So if you look at, democracy or a constitution, I mean, even countries that are authoritarian have what they call a constitution, right? And they all, at least, they pretend to have democracies, even if they don't really have a democracy. But his point here is that what he suspects over time. Remember, he's writing in 1960. The Berlin Wall doesn't fall until 1989, right? Mises, 1927. What's he saying? He says socialism can't work, right? So Hayek in 1960 is saying, oh, guess what? What Mises said was right. Socialism can't work. It's an unsuccessful society. And so what would we expect? We would expect over time as a movement towards market capitalism. Now, how do you move from a society that is not market capitalism to one that's there? That's an interesting question, right? How do you actually mechanically make that happen? But his point here is that it's spontaneous, but it is orderly, right? It's a spontaneous order in the sense that there's nobody in charge, but it's orderly in the sense that successful things move on and unsuccessful things don't. All right, so for Wednesday, we're going to spend a good deal of time on Chapter 5, and that's talking about individual responsibility. So we'll probably spend most of the lecture on Chapter 5. So go ahead and make sure you've read through the first 5 chapters by Wednesday.